The night Renata Voss told her daughter that Caleb Osei-Mensah would never be good enough, she said it loud enough for the entire room to hear. That was the part no one forgot. Not the words themselves. People had thought worse things and kept them private, but the volume, the deliberate, chin-up volume of a woman who had never once in her life felt the need to lower her voice. It was a Saturday in late October, the kind of evening that arrives in Ottawa with the smell of wood smoke and the first serious cold. The Voss family had rented out the private dining room at 16, a restaurant on Spark Street that Renata had chosen specifically because it intimidated people. High ceilings, linen napkins folded into cranes, a sommelier who introduced himself by his first name only. She liked rooms that reminded guests of their position, and she was skilled at arranging people into positions they hadn't shown. Caleb had arrived early, which was already a mistake. In rooms like that, arriving early meant standing near the entrance, without enough context to look comfortable. He wore the blazer he'd bought from a thrift shop in Hintonburg. Navy, single-breasted, a little wide in the shoulders, and he'd pressed it that morning with an iron he borrowed from his neighbor on Gladstone. He was 22. He'd been dating Claire Voss for 7 months, and this was the first time Renata had agreed to meet him. Claire was already inside. She looked up when he walked in, and for 1 second her face was open and warm and entirely like herself. Then she glanced toward her mother, and something shifted. It was subtle. He noticed it anyway. Renata Voss did not stand when Caleb approached the table. She looked at him the way someone looks at a weather report for a city they have no intention of visiting. "So," she said, "you're the one Claire's been spending her time with." "I am." He extended his hand. "Caleb Osei-Mensah. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Voss." She shook it once and released it before it could mean anything. The dinner moved through its stages the way a formal meal does when someone at the table has decided the outcome before the appetizers arrive. Renata asked Caleb what he did. He told her he was working days at a logistics company in Canada while taking night courses in business administration at Algonquin. She nodded at this the way people nod at answers that confirm what they already believed. She asked where his family was from. He told her. She asked if his parents were still together. He said his father had passed when he was 9, that his mother worked at the Queensway Carleton Hospital, had worked there for 18 years. Renata said that must be very hard. At no point did she ask him anything that sounded like curiosity. Every question had the shape of a perimeter being drawn. It was during the main course that it happened. Renata had been talking about the Voss property holdings, a conversation Caleb had not been invited into but had been allowed to witness. And Claire had made some small comment about Caleb having ideas about commercial real estate, that he'd been reading about the Canada North Tech Corridor, that he thought there might be something worth watching there. Renata set down her fork. "Claire," she said her daughter's name the way you'd say stop. "I think it's lovely that he has ideas. But let's not confuse enthusiasm with qualification." The table went quiet. There were 6 people seated. Caleb, Claire, Renata, Claire's uncle Patrick Holt, a woman named Brigitte Sinclair who was Renata's closest friend, and who had the particular talent of being present without seeming to have an opinion, and a man introduced only as Craig from the Voss Company's legal team. "What does that mean?" Claire said. She was trying to keep her voice even. "It means," Renata said, picking up her fork again, "that there's a difference between reading about something and having the foundation to act on it. And foundation takes time. It takes background. It takes," she paused as if selecting the word carefully, "a certain kind of start in life." Caleb looked at her. He did not look away, and he did not fill the silence. That was the moment Brigitte Sinclair decided she liked him, though she would not say so until years later. Renata turned to him directly. "I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to be honest with my daughter, who I think deserves someone who can meet her at her level. What you have is potential. Potential is not a plan, Mom." Claire's voice had dropped. "I'm not finished. I've built something real, Caleb. This family has built something real. And I need to know that the person beside my daughter understands what that means. I need to know he can hold his weight." She looked at him across the white tablecloth, across the crane-shaped napkins, across the full distance she had constructed between them. "And I don't think you're there yet. I don't think you're close." Patrick Holt looked at his wineglass. Craig from legal looked at his phone. Brigitte Sinclair looked at the middle distance and thought about something else entirely. Claire did not say anything. That was the part Caleb would return to later in the years that followed. Not the words. Not Renata's deliberate, measured cruelty. The silence from the person beside him who had not once in the entire length of that dinner said, "That is not true." He drove home to his apartment on Carling Avenue, the one he shared with 2 roommates, the one with the radiator that rattled in winter, and he sat in his car for a while in the parking lot. The Ottawa River was somewhere behind the buildings. He could not see it, but he knew it was there. He did not call Claire that night. She texted him twice. He read both messages and put his phone face down on the kitchen counter. The following 3 days felt like the inside of a held breath. On the 4th day, Caleb met Claire at a cafe on Bank Street and told her, quietly and without theatrics, that he thought they should take a step back. She cried. He did not, which was not because he didn't want to. She asked if it was because of her mother. He said it wasn't just that. He said it was about knowing where he stood, and that he needed to go somewhere he could see clearly from. She asked what that meant. He wasn't sure how to explain it in a way that didn't sound like a line from a film, so he didn't try. What it meant was this. He had sat in that parking lot on Carling Avenue and understood, with the particular clarity that humiliation sometimes delivers, that he did not yet have the ground beneath him that he wanted. Not to prove anything to Renata Voss, to prove something to himself. He had been circling it for years. The night courses, the job, the reading, and he'd been treating those things like a hobby when they needed to be a mission. He called his cousin Jerome the next morning. Jerome was a mortgage broker in Toronto who had been telling Caleb for 2 years that he had the instincts for real estate and was wasting them. Caleb told him he was ready to stop wasting them. The next 4.5 years were not cinematic. That is worth saying plainly, because the temptation in stories like this one is to collapse time into a highlight reel. The first deal, the big break, the moment everything changed. But it wasn't like that. It was mornings that started at 5:30 and evenings that ended at 11. It was finishing the business diploma and enrolling in a real estate investment course through the University of Ottawa's continuing education program. It was his mother lending him $8,000, money she had saved for a new car, without him asking, just handing him an envelope one Sunday after church and saying she believed in the direction he was going. It was the first property, a semi-detached on Gladstone, the same street where he'd borrowed the iron, that he bought with Jerome and 2 other partners, renovated on evenings and weekends, and sold 14 months later for a return that felt almost implausible. He stood in the driveway on the day of closing and thought about calling someone, and then realized he didn't know who he would call. His mother. He called his mother. It was the second property, then the third. A mixed-use building in Hintonburg that took 10 months of negotiation and 2 financing collapses before it finally closed. A commercial unit in Canada North. Exactly the corridor he'd mentioned at that dinner that tripled in value when 2 tech companies announced they were expanding their footprints within 18 months of his purchase. He built a small firm, OC Property Group. 3 people at first, then 7, then 14. He brought on a woman named Delphine Marsh who had grown up in Ottawa's South End and knew the city the way only people who had actually lived it could. He brought on a young analyst named Ruben Achterberg who had a talent for seeing what a neighborhood would be before the city planners had finished deciding. They were good at this. They were genuinely good at it. He did not think about Renata Voss often. That is the truth, and it matters, because the story he was building was not about her. It was about Gladstone Avenue and the borrowed iron and the $8,000 in an envelope from his mother and Jerome on the phone from Toronto saying, "You have the instincts. Stop circling and move." The story was about those things, and Renata Voss was not in them. But sometimes the city has a way of folding. The Voss Group had been struggling for approximately 2 years before anyone outside their inner circle acknowledged it publicly. Renata Voss had expanded aggressively in 2021 and 2022, acquiring a cluster of commercial properties along a stretch of downtown Ottawa that had not recovered from the pandemic's structural shifts the way she had projected. Vacancy rates stayed high. Interest rates rose. Two anchor tenants who had seemed stable left within 6 months of each other, and the financing structure Renata had built relied on a performance timeline that the market had quietly stopped honoring. The portfolio that had taken 3 generations of the Voss family to assemble was going to need to be sold. Not all of it, but a meaningful piece of it. And whoever acquired that piece would have to be patient and capitalized and willing to work with a family that did not easily accept the position of having to ask. Caleb heard about it through Delphine, who had heard about it through a contact at one of the major commercial brokerages. He sat with the information for 2 weeks before he said anything. When he told Ruben went quiet in the way he always did when he was running numbers in his head. "Do we have the capacity?" Caleb asked. "We'd need a partner," Ruben said. "But yes, I think so. If the terms are what I think they are." "Pull the data," Caleb said. "All of it. Every property in the portfolio, current valuations, tenant status, debt structure as far as we can access it publicly. Give me everything." It took 3 weeks to assemble the offer. Caleb reviewed it on a Thursday evening in his office on Bank Street. A real office now, 3rd floor, view of the canal. And then he put it in a folder and looked at the canal for a long time. He thought about whether this was a decision he was making for the right reasons. He thought about it seriously. The answer he arrived at, honestly, was mostly. The acquisition made genuine strategic sense. The properties were undervalued given their long-term location advantage. The Canada holdings alone were worth the conversation. If he removed his own history from the picture entirely, he would still be making this offer. But he was also human, and he had been 22 and pressed a thrift shop blazer and sat at a table where a woman had told him, in a room full of people, that he was not enough. He was allowed to hold both of those things at once. The meeting was arranged through the Voss Group's CFO, a man named Desmond Firth, who had a reputation for handling difficult situations with a kind of exhausted professionalism. He did not know who Caleb Osei-Mensah was when the initial inquiry arrived. He found out within 24 hours. He called Caleb directly. "I have to ask," he said, "whether there's a personal element to this." "There's a professional element," Caleb said. "The personal element is not relevant to the offer." Desmond Firth was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Voss will want to be in the room." "That's fine." The meeting happened on a Tuesday in February, which in Ottawa means gray sky and the kind of cold that makes every surface feel provisional. They met at the Voss Group's offices in a Centertown building that had the particular atmosphere of a company that had once been more successful than it currently was. The lobby was beautiful and slightly dated, and there were photos on the wall of groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings from decades past. Renata Voss walked into the boardroom with Patrick Holt behind her and Desmond Firth beside her, and she stopped when she saw Caleb. It was a full stop, the kind that means the body has recognized something before the mind has finished processing it. She sat down. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "I wasn't told. We weren't sure it was relevant," Desmond said. "How long ago?" she asked, and it wasn't clear whether she was asking Desmond or asking Caleb or asking some version of herself. 4.5 years, Caleb said. She looked at him. He looked back, and his face was the same face it had been across the white tablecloth at 16. Not hostile, not triumphant, just present and level and waiting. They went through the offer. Caleb's team presented clean numbers and a clear development thesis. Patrick Holt asked several questions that were designed to find soft spots and did not find them. Desmond Firth asked about the financing structure, and Caleb walked him through it without hesitation. Renata said very little. She listened. At the end of the formal presentation, there was a brief pause. Caleb looked at the package on the table. "I want to say something," he said. "That's outside the business terms." No one objected. "I'm not here to collect something," he said. "I know what this looks like from where you're sitting. I know what the story sounds like. But I spent the last 4.5 years building something I'm proud of because I needed to know I could. not because I needed anyone else to see it. He paused. What I'm offering is fair. The terms are straightforward, and if the Voss name stays on the developments, which it can, that's negotiable, then what I'm actually doing is helping protect something your family built. That's not nothing. Renata Voss had been in business long enough to recognize when someone was not performing. He wasn't performing. She had also been in business long enough to know that this was the best offer she was going to receive, and that the market was not going to improve before her financing covenants required a resolution. She saw Famil 3 weeks later. The call came to Caleb's cell on a Thursday morning while he was standing in a Tim Hortons on Merivale Road, which felt somehow right, that a moment this large would arrive in a place this ordinary. He drove to his mother's house afterward. She was in the kitchen, getting ready for the afternoon shift at Queensway Carlton. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten breakfast every morning through high school, and told her. She stood at the counter for a moment with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. Then she said, "Your father would have liked to see this." That was the only time he came close to crying. Now, the part the offer documents don't record. 3 months after the acquisition closed, Caleb received call from Claire. He had not spoken to her since the Bank Street Cafe 7 years prior. Her voice on the phone sounded like someone who had thought carefully about whether to make the call. She told him she had been following what he'd built. She told him she was sorry, not for the dinner itself, not for her mother's words exactly, but for her own silence. "I knew what that dinner was," she said. "I knew what she was doing and I didn't say anything. I've thought about that a lot." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I know you did." "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm good," he said, and meant it. He did not ask about her mother. She did not volunteer. There was a civility to the call that felt genuinely hard-won on both sides, and he appreciated that she hadn't tried to wrap it into something neater than it was. What happened with Renata Voss in the end was not what most people expected. She did not disappear from the industry or from Ottawa's social architecture. She was too embedded for that. What changed was the posture. The negotiations that followed the signing had been the first time in decades that Renata Voss had sat on the other side of a table and not held the advantage, and it had done something to her that she would not have predicted and would not easily describe. She ran into Caleb at an industry reception at the Shaw Center about 8 months after the deal closed. She walked over to him, which no one in her orbit expected. She said in a voice that was private and did not carry, "I said something to you at a dinner that I've thought about more than once. You don't have to do this," Caleb said. "I know I don't have to." A pause. "I misjudged what I was looking at. That's not something I'm often in a position to say." He nodded once. He did not offer her absolution, because it was not his to give and she hadn't asked for it. What he offered instead was something more useful. He moved on. He turned back toward the person he'd been speaking with. He kept building. And here is what remains worth saying. Beyond the deals and the properties and the signed documents, the night of that dinner, Caleb sat in his car in the parking lot on Carling Avenue and thought about a man who told him, years ago, that the world would show him his ceiling plenty of times and that his only job was to refuse to look up. That man was his father, who had died when Caleb was 9, and whom he had mostly assembled from memory, and from things his mother had said over 18 years of morning coffee. He thought about that for a long time. Then he went inside and made a list. Just a list. Things he needed to learn, steps he needed to take, people he needed to call. Nothing dramatic. A piece of notebook paper on his kitchen counter, next to the borrowed iron he'd never returned. That list is still somewhere in a box in his office on Bank Street. He doesn't need to look at it anymore. But he hasn't thrown it away either. Some things you hold on to not because they still hurt, but because they remind you of the exact moment you decided what you were made of. And that is always worth knowing.